Thanks to its Hasselblad 1-inch sensor, the Mavic 2 Pro has always been by far the best drone for photography in the Mavic line, even though the recent Mavic Air 2 has somehow partly bridged the gap with several new interesting technologies. People often ask if the Mavic 2 Pro can be used for professional photography, so in this video I'm going to analyze the quality and the functionalities of the 2 Pro. And in certain cases I will compare the result to the Nikon D850, a full-frame camera widely used by professionals. I know that this is an unusual comparison, but I believe it is going to interest many photographers and also it's gonna be fun. So, let's get going. I know many people are going to say that it's unfair to compare a drone to a professional full-frame camera costing almost 3 times more, if we include good lenses. But the point is obviously not to find out which one is better, but rather to understand if and under which conditions the Mavic 2 Pro can be considered suitable for professional use. The size sensor of the 2 Pro is 16 by 9 mm, 6 times smaller than the 24 by 36 of the Nikon D850. Of course, there is no comparison in the size and the amount of glass in the lenses. There is also a big difference in resolution, with the 20 megapixels of the 2 Pro versus the 45.4 of the D850. So the point here is to see if the amount of quality we lose with the drone is compensated by the huge flexibility of being able to fly. Let's start with easy conditions. Good light with limited amount of dynamic range. These are the situations where we should expect the Mavic to perform at its best. In the first image, in my opinion, the 2 Pro does an excellent job. Certainly much better than what I used to get with the Mavic 2 Zoom. In the full image, the sky and the sea have a good structure, although we notice that the D850 has a richer color palette. Also, there is a relatively high dynamic range, as the sun is just in the middle of the frame, although behind the clouds. The 2 Pro handled the situation extremely well. It managed to avoid blowing the highlight, which is remarkable. The D850 obviously renders the sky a bit better, but the difference is not huge. In this deep crop in the center, we notice more detail for the D850 in the buildings and the umbrellas on the beach, but again the difference is not as severe as I was expecting, if we consider the difference in resolution. There is also a hint of noise in the mountain behind the tall yellow building for the Mavic 2 Pro, but nothing to write home about. Overall in this image the 2 Pro is certainly not put to shame by the D850. Excellent performance, way above my expectations. In this close-up image the 2 Pro cannot blur the background like the D850 does, and this is obvious, due to the difference in size of the sensors. Also there is a bit more detail in the foreground elements for the D850, but the image taken with the drone is very pleasant, and the sky is kept under control. In this image of Isola Bella in Taormina in Sicily, the 2 Pro does again a decent job, although I prefer the color rendition of the D850. But it must be said that the weather conditions were changing really fast, and the one with the drone was taken with more difficult light, just before the storm. Once again, the D850 has a bit more detail in the crop, but the 2 Pro does an excellent job too. So let's see how the bigger 1-inch Hasselblad sensor of the Mavic 2 Pro performs at different ISO values. This is a very deep crop of the central part of the image to better appreciate any difference in quality. Of course there is no denoising or sharpening applied, just a basic color grading. At ISO 100 the image is very good, even at this crop level, with excellent detail and hardly any noise. At ISO 200 a little bit of noise starts to creep in, but very manageable, while there is no significant loss of detail. At ISO 400 the quality still holds remarkably well, considering the very deep crop, and I would call it still usable with the aid of a good denoiser. Even the fine detail in the trees in the foreground is still well preserved. At ISO 800 things start to seriously deteriorate. There is a high level of noise in the sea, and a good amount of detail is gone, both in the buildings and in the trees. Personally, I would not consider ISO 800 usable for serious photography. Even if we apply a good denoiser, the image will get much softer and the lack of detail is evident. Just out of curiosity, this is what the image looks like at ISO 1600. But let's see how it compares to the Nikon D850. We can see that at ISO 400 the image is absolutely pristine. The detail is absolutely perfect. At ISO 800 we start to see a bit of noise in the sea, but remember the depth of the cropped. There is practically no degradation in the detail of the image. At 1600 the noise increases, but once again the detail, sharpness and vibrance of the image hold very well, and I would consider it still usable. At ISO 3200 the image is borderline, but I frankly find it a bit too noisy. I am very impressed with the performance of the 2 Pro at different ISO values compared to other prosumer models, although obviously it cannot match the D850. I consider ISO 400 fully usable, and the ability to use 1.5 extra stop of ISO compared to the 2 zoom is indeed very handy. If we analyze the image in full size, some user might be happy to go even up to ISO 800, according to how they intend to use their shots. But the Mavic 2 Pro has a very interesting trick up its sleeve for low light situations. It's a mode called Hyperlight, which can be chosen in the photo menu. In this mode the camera will go in auto mode and generate a JPEG file. I've taken several shots of the same scene after sunset, at a 10-minute interval, up until pitch dark. As you can see the images are really clear, with hardly any noise at all, some sort of black magic. The JPEG files are certainly heavily processed, but it is still possible to apply some basic color grading. Hyperlight is an extremely interesting new technology, introduced with the Mavic 2 Pro and enhanced 2 years later with the Mavic Air 2. I'm not going into technical details here on how Hyperlight works, as I will do a specific dedicated video about it. But if you shoot photos in very low light, you should definitely give it a try. This is an area where previous Mavic models used to perform extremely poorly, to the point that I would avoid shooting anywhere in the direction of the sun. But this is understandable because of the small size and build of the lenses. Even with the 2 Pro, I personally still avoid shots with the full sun in the frame, as there will be flare, chromatic aberrations and loss of contrast and detail. But let's see how it performs in situations not too extreme, like against the sun partially shielded by clouds. In this image of the east coast of Sicily, the result is sensational compared to other Mavic models. The sky is not overblown, there is a good structure both in the sky and the sea, the color rendition and the contrast are still quite nice, in spite of the very difficult conditions. Of course, I had to lift the shadows a lot, but the amount of noise is still contained, and the detail is acceptable, as you can see in this crop. The image taken with the D850 is only slightly better, with richer colors and a tiny bit more detail in the crop. But the 2 Pro is very close. Incredible stuff. For this kind of images, the Mavic 2 Pro offers 2 other possibilities. There is a mode called HDR, which works in auto and produces a JPEG file by taking several shots and merging them together. To be honest, I never got any interesting result with this mode. The image looks washed out, with very little contrast and poor colors. Also, the JPEG file falls apart very quickly if we try to color grade it. I would frankly avoid it. Then there is the automatic bracketed exposure. In this mode the camera will take 3 or 5 shots at an interval of 0.7 stops. I recommend taking 5 shots, which give us a range of minus 1.3 stops up to plus 1.3. I would prefer a much bigger range between each shot for a bolder final result. The image generated are raw files that I then merged using Lightroom. And this is the result. If we compare it to the single image made with the 2 Pro, I find there is a better structure in the sky and the sea. And it even rivals the quality of the one taken with the D850. Extraordinary result. When considering to use the Mavic 2 Pro for professional photography, image quality is not the only factor to consider. The main reason is of course the fact that the camera is attached to an aircraft, and therefore it is possible to take photos from totally different points of view. In a drone, photographers are often looking to the extra flexibility offered. As an example, top-down bird's-eye views, which often yields very surprising results. The 2 Pro features a very interesting panorama mode, which in my opinion adds to the great creativity offered by a drone. It is of course possible to perform panorama shots with a traditional camera, but the point of view high up in the sky is perfectly suited for this technique, especially in sphere mode, where we can get a 360-degree image. I would not go here into detail about how the panorama mode works, as I have covered it in depth in 2 other videos about drone photography. Please relate to them if you're interested in this mode. You will find the link on screen now. With the Mavic 2 Pro, the DJI Mavic line has started to take photography seriously, and the improvement in quality compared to previous models are massive. The major improvements are in the weakest points: low light performance and high dynamic range images. We should also add that it is the only model of the Mavic line to offer manual variable aperture, which is extremely useful in photography. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Bye for now.